So this is Rethinking the Enterprise Perimeter, and I'm Patrick Walsh. My background in brief, I've spent about 20 years in security doing things like threat research, antivirus detection, intrusion prevention, building enterprise security solutions, most recently for Oracle before I moved to my own company, Iron Core Labs. One thing that has really stuck in my head lately is the amount of spending on what I would call classic security products versus what I think of as more modern security products. It's about a 5-to-1 ratio between those two things. And I'll get more specific, so if you look at it, and you can argue with me, by the way, feel free to, about what is classic and what is modern. But I would say cloud security, which is less than 1%. I would say application security, and I would say data security should be in that modern category. And network security, infrastructure, and identity are way, way, way more of the spending overall for product spending. This ignores services today. Why? Why is that? No, really, I'm asking you. Like, that wasn't rhetorical. Why do you think?
Because we know how to do it.
We know how to do it. Tradition. Totally love those answers, by the way. What else? Why else? Do you?
Attack surface.
Attack surface is bigger on the network, you think?
Well, you're trying to limit it, right? So the traditional tools are just trying to shrink.
I think you can mitigate some of those application data security stuff with the infrastructure.
Well, that's a really good point. Yeah, people think that maybe the network will magically solve the application's problems. Do you think that really happens? Sure, we'll do two more. Yeah.
What about information security awareness training?
Information security awareness training, like where does it fall on this? Probably goes into services, which I cut out because I limited it just to products. Yeah.
Those are the tangible things that people understand.
Because of understanding, maybe like training and stuff. Yeah. Here's another way of thinking about this. Oh, sure, one more.
I think the cloud is secure, so you don't have to worry about it.
Oh, yeah, they tell us the cloud is secure. Sure. Do you believe that? No, me either. So we were sitting here. Let me give you a different hypothesis. We're sitting here in OWASP, web application security. Okay. If we think about web application and security, I would argue that the people who create the web applications, the people who secure them, tend to be different. And there's something of what I would call an organizational firewall between them. Does that ring true? Lots of nodding. That's good. Let me just ask, in the room, how many people work for a security or IT part of their organization? Show of hands. Wow, nearly everyone. And how many people for product development? A couple. I would call that about the same ratio as a pie chart we just saw, actually. I didn't know that would work out so well, but I kind of hoped. So, I would argue further that like the security folks, their job is security, and the things that they have control of are the things that the IT organization has control of. That is to say, the network, the infrastructure, and things like that. And therefore, they put their spending in the areas that they can most control. And that to the extent that there's a lot of cooperation between those organizations, it tends to be around the things that are on fire, the audit results, the vulnerabilities that are big. And when it comes to proactive security, things that are more forward-thinking, building something on a strong platform or what have you, that tends to not necessarily happen because on the engineering side, their primary job is not security, their primary job is new features. Security is attacks on that side of the organization. And that's where application security would go and data security. Cloud security is sort of a weird thing I actually didn't know how to put between here because it a little bit depends, right? Development teams are constantly spinning up cloud things and they don't necessarily talk to security guys, they slow them down. So maybe it depends on your organization on that. Totally different direction for a second, and hang with me and you'll see how they come together. Since 2017, there are about 100 new laws, privacy laws around the world at the country level. They're significant and different. On the state level, it's kind of exploding too. We all know about CCPA in California, which is highlighted here, but actually there's been about 18 new ones passed recently for different states, or 19, I think, and 18 more that are like working their way through right now. So there's an explosion of privacy laws right now around the world. And a couple stats about that. First of all, why do you think that is? Maybe I won't name names or shame people or anything, but I would argue that perhaps some bad behavior led to a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction. And the knee-jerk reaction has had a huge impact on our industry. And that impact is that PII, personally identifiable information, is now toxic data. That is to say that it is everywhere, we all hold it, and all of a sudden now it's regulated, and like, what the hell? Okay? Try and get your hands around where that stuff is in your organization or in general, and good luck to you. And that's step one. And that's pretty much where everyone is stuck right now. But I'm gonna look a little bit farther than that in the rest of this presentation. So PII is toxic. No one in particular to blame. How the heck do we protect PII? Well, I mean, in some ways that seems simple. It's like the same thing we've always done. Perhaps that's one way to look at it. I would argue that that's probably the wrong way to look at it. In fact, I'm going to talk about a little bit of the history of the evolution of security from my point of view, thinking of it from the concept of the perimeter. Okay? This gets back to the title of the talk, what you came for. Maybe initially we had a very like castle walls view of the world. We were very isolated. We could focus on our perimeter. And then we got a little more sophisticated on our perimeters. We got a little more sophisticated on our perimeters. We started segmenting more and saying, like the things over here don't need to interact with the things over there. And then we brought that perimeter, we kept shrinking it all the way down to the devices. Okay, and I would argue this is where we are today. We have device endpoint security, that is to say on our servers we have intrusion prevention, we have logging, we have monitoring. On our laptops we have that, on our mobile devices we have mobile device management, and a whole way of keeping secure the things that float outside of the organization. Well, the devices that float outside of the organization. A t-shirt to what like the next step in this evolution might look like or should look like. Anyone have, like, where does this go from here? Is that as far as it goes?
To the data.
The damn data, yes. So yeah, I mean, I would argue the data is what's next, because the data is floating in and out of that perimeter. The perimeter is not actually containing the data today because it's not the model that we work in, right? The model that we work in is one of sharing data, not one of hoarding data. And so, like, what the hell do you do about that data? It's not nicely in your perimeter. I don't care how many perimeters you have. I don't care how many VLANs you have. It sort of doesn't matter because it's flowing through, right? If we think about how we share data with partners, we have services, we have all these different things, and those partners have partners, and they have services. And that thing is, I don't know how deep it goes. Like, here's 2 levels, but it doesn't stop there, right? This is the state that we live in today. And here's an example with it, maybe more practically speaking, okay? So, in this world today, it would be pretty common for a large organization to use maybe ADP to hold all their private information on their employees and their salary and deal with that, and maybe to use Slack for internal communications. Lord knows what's in those communications. I guarantee that's full of toxic crap, meaning PII, among other things. Office 365, Box, Salesforce, that stuff is just rife with toxic data today. It's all over the place. It's flowing out of the organizations with those. Maybe we trust those organizations. They have great perimeters too, right? And that's sort of the model that we live on, is let's assume that that's worth trusting. But let me take you back in time for a minute. How many people here remember the PGP Web of Trust? Way more than I expected. Who here has been to a public key signing party? Okay, that's more like what I expected to see. Me too, by the way. So the PGP Web of Trust is basically a failed approach to security, unfortunately, because it's a cool idea, right? The idea is that if I want to communicate securely with someone, I need to know their public key. How do I trust that it's really their public key and not the NSA's public key or something like that, right? Well, the idea is that I will vouch for people I know and for their public keys. I'll sign them. They'll vouch for people they know and they'll sign them. And then we'll all basically implicitly trust anyone who someone I know or they know or they know or they know trusts. And it creates this whole web of indirect trust. Now, in practice, this is problematic because actually there's islands and they don't cross. And it's also problematic, though, because it's really, really easily poisoned. You have one person who makes a bad decision, they think they trust something, or they just say it lightly, and it poisons the whole damn network really fast, right? So pretty quickly, no one ever trusted the web of trust. It was like really more of a web of haha, not really, right? But the difference between this and what I just showed you a second ago is you can introspect the web of trust. You can look and see and theoretically tell if there's maybe a bad actor. I have no, like, I put a few things up there under Slack. I'm like, oh yeah, sure, they use, Splunk. I don't know if they use Splunk. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Like, who the hell knows what data is going into their logs or where they're shipping them or anything else for that matter, right? It is a total black box. So today, we have this trust, but it's really chains of trust. It's really a web of trust with zero introspection. Okay, so that's my setup. The whole rest of this presentation is actually solutions. I'd argue that there's kind of 4 options here. And the first 2 might look like jokes to you, but I really don't think, they feel a little bit like jokes, but they're really not. One option is don't share. Like, you're investing a ton into your perimeter. Why not just bring everything back on-prem and stop sharing and hunker down. And there are companies that are doing that today. I would have laughed at that a couple years ago. I actually laugh at it less today, believe it or not, because I think it's so out of control. Hope for the best, wait and see. This is like let's work with a trust model, let's not do anything. Our partners, that's their responsibility, not ours. We'll see how it shakes out. So what happens is these laws, in particular around privacy, they don't specify technology for the most part. Very little, right? They're trying to be forward thinking. As the technology evolves, they don't want their law to suddenly be outmoded, right? And so what they leave it to is the courts to figure out, where is that bar going to be set? And let me give you a hint. The first person that gets breached, I don't care what they were doing, the bar was too low because they got breached. And so that's what will start really moving the needle and defining oh no, it's not sufficient just to have intrusion prevention. That's not really data protection by design and by default, right? That's the type of thing that will shake that free. But in the meantime, I would argue that most of the market is waiting on the sidelines and saying, we'll just figure out where it is and what to do with it later. Okay, the other two things are basically privacy preserving techniques, and I'll go through a couple of these, or encryption patterns, and I'll go through a couple of these as well. Privacy preserving techniques. Let's start with disassociation of names. Hypothetically, let's pretend we have data that we want to share, and that data involves bank account balances. Okay, what are we going to do about that? Well, let's just, if we share it, let's just not send out the names, right? No names, no problem, right? I mean, can anyone guess which row is Jeff Bezos? Oh, I'm serious. It could. 3! You're spying on Jeff, he can spy back on you. Pass that back to the gentleman in the back. Yeah, the problem is you could disassociate all you want. There's still a lookup table somewhere, first of all, but second of all, even if you share out that information, you're leaking a crap load of data, right? It's just a total fiction to think that removing a name actually means that data is de-identified. What's another way of doing this? Almost the same thing, but worth mentioning, is tokenization. Because tokenization, where I sit, is the thing I hear about the most. Tokenization, or pseudonymization, effectively the same thing, is just replacing the name with a different value. Does that move the needle from our perspective of trying to identify things? It doesn't. The one thing it does get you, though, and that's good, is that from an internal access point of view, you usually have a token server of some kind, and that server is providing, is like an extra access control to who gets to see that column of data. And so, if you're not looking at the Jeff Bezos of the world, maybe it's better. So it's not valueless. Actually, none of these things are valueless, and there are places where disassociation is going to be good too. So I want to, I'm going to talk about the negatives for some of these things, but I want everyone to be clear that I'm not saying it's never appropriate. Certainly it is. So controlling the lookup table is better than not, frankly, at the end of the day. Okay. K-anonymization. Anyone know what K-anonymization is? One in the room. So it's this idea that basically you have at least K rows in the database that are identical, minimum, guaranteed. Okay? So in my toy example here, we did 2 anonymization. Okay? That means that for any given set of values, there are at least 2 rows for each one. So now what we've done is we've basically used a bucketing technique in this case, and then we've kind of obliterated one of the columns in order to say, now I don't really know which one is Jeff Bezos. In this case, it's one of 2 people could be Jeff Bezos. So now at least I don't definitively know who Jeff Bezos is. K-anonymization is a pretty good technique, and it's worth pursuing. But you got to watch out with K-anonymization, because it's really, really easy for us to focus in on what we think we understand about the data and not realize that data joins to other things. And the joining problem is a huge problem in privacy, because even if it's perfect today, and this is all the data, there's a developer that comes along, they add a table, it joins to this table, and there's more data, and now you don't have your 2 anonymization property anymore because you have some new set of fields, and your uniqueness level has just changed. So it's really hard to design this stuff in such a way that's future-proof. And I'll talk in a few minutes about why you don't even just have to think within your own database. Because if you're only thinking with your own database, you're actually probably also screwing up. But that said, this is a good technique in many cases as well, right? Bucketing is a good way to preserve people's privacy, and it may be more than sufficient. Bucketing by itself is good. K-anonymization as guarantees that no one will have a unique set of values for some value of k, which should be bigger than 2, by the way. Like, hopefully, you're not using my example as a pathway. Last one I'll talk about is differential privacy. Who's heard of differential privacy before? A couple people. It was sort of popularized by Apple. It was really like an academic thing, I think, until Apple made a big deal about it. This is more about aggregate data and statistical data. It's been used in censuses for a long time, actually. It's more of a property. Actually, k-anonymity is a property as well. It's a property. How you get to that property is different ways to do it, right? Same thing with differential privacy. It's really kind of a way of hiding things. But the way I see it most commonly done is like this. You take something like, in this example, pretend that I'm an antivirus company, maybe that likes to sell data, and I'm taking a survey of all the applications on someone's hard drive so that I can sell data about what applications are installed on people's hard drives, for example. Well, one way to preserve some of that privacy is to introduce some randomness to it. So for any given report on what applications are installed, I'll randomly add and remove a couple applications. And the idea is I do this at a level such that when I summarize everything later and I sum it all up, that I have a margin of error, but that margin of error is well known and understood and acceptable right up front. And if I were to look at a specific record, I couldn't actually say for any given person, do they actually have app2 installed or not installed? I don't really know because I don't know which ones were randomized. That was done before it was sent to me. And so differential privacy is suitable for these aggregation use cases where you're trying to protect the privacy of the folks who are contributing. There's other techniques. This is just the one that I mostly see. But that's the idea. You all with me so far? All right, that was it for that. No, that's not. There's one more slide. So in general, when I think about the privacy techniques, these ideas of fuzzing the data, redacting the data, bucketizing the data, and that sort of thing, the good news is, like GDPR expressly calls that out as okay. De-identification is expressly put in there as a thing you can do to protect privacy of people. It's relatively simple change to make. It's certainly, for most of the time, it's relatively easy to understand, at least on a first level. On the negative side, though, if the data is re-identifiable, you're still on the hook, even with GDPR. So like, yeah, you can de-identify it, but if you didn't do it good enough, it's your fault, right? And so what does that mean? These things are puzzles. What you have to understand is these data sets with the names removed or that specific identifying data removed, they're puzzles, they're cryptograms. Who's ever played a cryptogram? Who knows what a cryptogram is? Okay, a couple people. Not as many as I thought, or else not. People were kind of shy, like I was going to ask them to solve one.
That's why I was shy, is that you're the goddamn maddening.
It looks something like this, right? And it's a Caesar cipher, and the idea is that you're trying to figure out what letters go where based on, it's usually a quote, and it's usually a thing where if you know, let's do this for some kind of prize. I'm running out of prizes, I went too fast. For an antivirus, who knows what the most common, in order, the most common 6 letters are in English language? Eta-oin, E-T-A-O-I-N. Best thing you can know to solve one of these things, right? You look at the frequencies, you can start guessing. Probably the one that is the most frequent is going to be an E, et cetera. Okay? Frequency analysis is a very, very powerful tool for reversing this kind of thing, and it works just the same on de-identified data as it does on cryptograms. It's actually a real pain in the ass for cryptographers too in cryptography, especially deterministic encryption if you ever go that way. So that's what a cryptogram is, and that's basically what de-identified data is. It means the more data that's available, the more likely it is that someone can start figuring it out and reversing it. And the more things you fill in, the more you can fill in the rest. To that end, let's talk a little bit about New York Times real quick, right? They've done a ton of great privacy work this year. One of the things they did was they said, look, the weather app tracks anyone who has the Weather Channel app, anyone who has it installed, they're tracking where they are all the time. They strip the names from all that data, and they share the location information as aggregate sets. New York Times is like, hey, we can buy that. I wonder, what happens if we join that with like public white pages information? Oh, we have people's home addresses now joined to that data. And what about LinkedIn? Oh, now we have business. They trivially reversed all this information back to people because effectively they were taking this data set, which is like, oh, yeah, it's just a bunch of location points, and it doesn't have anyone's names attached to it, but they were able to take that and attach it back. And this has happened over and over with different types of things, right? So it's not even just this. 3 points of purchasing information are enough, right? Yes. I got that from Janelle. So that's the danger of that stuff, right? When you're thinking about, it's cool, you can't figure anything out from that data set. It is, as a designer of these types of systems, it is our inclination to think in isolation about the data and not really think about how it can be joined to other data sets. And the joining to other data sets is where the danger is, because the more you can add to it, the easier it is to solve the puzzle. And re-identification, it doesn't matter that someone joined another data set to it. If it's re-identifiable, that's your problem. You didn't de-identify it for GDPR not sufficiently. All right, encryption patterns. So let me talk to you about a pattern that is becoming more popular. I'm going to start with talking about Salesforce Shield. Who knows what Salesforce Shield is? Only a couple. Interesting. I thought it would be a little bit more. Shield is a feature that was announced in 2015. It's been a wildly successful feature. It's basically a premium security offering from Salesforce. They charge 30% extra of net pay to add the feature, at least for the full suite. And the suite includes platform encryption, per tenant encryption. It includes event monitoring and audit trails, okay? And feeding that information back. What's happening here is, so it's basically that top bar, if that wasn't totally clear. The table stakes security is defined in the bottom three. The premium security is that top bar. So what's interesting there's a bunch of things interesting about Salesforce Shield. I'll go into it in more detail, but one of the things that's interesting about Salesforce Shield is that it's penetrated almost all of their big customers and in the entire financial vertical. That is to say, the vast majority of their larger customers are paying for this and are paying that upcharge. The next thing that's interesting about it is it allows those organizations to use their existing key management system, particularly when they're using the cache-only key service, to manage and control the keys and even hold those keys. They have essentially a leasing model where they lend the keys to Salesforce, but they drop those keys once a day and they have to refresh that. So there's a revocation capability. Because of the event monitoring and the audit trail information, that all feeds back into the purchasing company's SIM. So they get to monitor and watch their data and understand their data and how it's being accessed and by whom and from where within Salesforce. Effectively, this is a way to extend a perimeter around a vendor. Right? You're using your existing SOC. Your security operations center gets to use its existing tools. It's already monitoring your stuff within your realms of ownership. And now you expand that to monitor your stuff, your data in particular, within your vendors. So that's cool. Also, subpoena resistance, worth a mention. A lot of big companies worry about foreign governments subpoenaing their data directly and quietly and silently from their vendors, right? This is more of a thing of like, if it came directly to us, we'd fight it. We want to be able to fight it, maybe if it doesn't apply. And in fact, if you look at the data, for the few companies that do fight it, which is basically just Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, or at least who also publish results, 1 in 4 of their compelled access requests are invalid. That is to say that it's outside of the jurisdiction or too broad or something like that. So when they push back, 1 in 4 fall away. Salesforce still has server-side access. They can do most everything they need to do in this case. Yes?
So you brought up a point I was just thinking about. Basically, in a cloud shared security model, the cloud provider says we're responsible for the cloud, and you're responsible for what's in the cloud. So there's somewhat of a separation of responsibility for your data.
Mm-hmm.
So are there any additional security controls or controls in general that we as a consumer of cloud services, Salesforce, whoever, can put into place to obfuscate our data from the cloud provider, so that in the case of the use case here of a government agency subpoenaing the data, they'll get the data, but it'll be useless to them?
Well, so this is one of the surprising things about this pattern, to me at least, is that, so they have platform encryption, but they hold the keys. And so you'd think, well, then they can give the government the data. But the way Salesforce does this is they actually take a copy of the database, and they have totally different systems that hold the keys. They take a copy of the database, they move it to a clean room, and then they filter and produce the data that's being requested by law enforcement for them from that offline copy of the data, and they send that out, and that includes encrypted data. It goes out encrypted to the law enforcement. If law enforcement wants the decrypted version, they have to go ask the company, or they have to find a way to compel Salesforce to make software changes. So today, you do have subpoena resistance from this, even though it's server-side keys, because of how they've separated that from their database.
Okay.
Subject to change, right? Australia is pushing some bounds there. We'll find out if that stands up. But But today, yeah, there is subpoena resistance even on that. Otherwise, the answer to that would normally be client-side encryption. We'll talk about it in a second. So I'll just point out that Shield is not, Salesforce, I gave them a bunch of thumbs up. First of all, they don't push back against subpoenas. So if you're not using platform encryption, you're probably screwed. But Slack has announced this feature. Rally has announced this feature. Carbon Black announced it. Box has had it for several years. So it's not just Salesforce. It's starting to spread within the industry. It's worth mentioning. Now, if there's many more companies, I don't know of them yet. Yeah, they're coming. Is there something else to say there? No. OK. Second pattern. This is sort of 2A and 2B. This is the proxy pattern for encryption. This is the idea that you put something in between request and response somewhere, and on the way from point A to point B, something gets encrypted, or from B to A, it gets decrypted. Okay? And there's sort of two variants that this comes in. One that might be familiar to a lot of you called Cloud Access Security Brokers, or CASB. That's been around for a while. That industry kind of started in 2012 and blew up a few years ago. That's where basically you would have a service that sits between your people and, let's say, Salesforce, and some segment of data gets encrypted on the way to Salesforce and decrypted on the way back. And the problem with CASB is that it's brittle. Something changes on Salesforce, it breaks, Salesforce doesn't know that the data is encrypted, so a bunch of functionality that they thought should work, it really doesn't. It's a little bit brittle. The other thing that we see a bunch is, and this is like Netscope and Sky High Networks and folks like that are pretty big names these days. The other proxy pattern we see a lot, or at least more increasing these days, is the database proxy. This is the idea that the application doesn't have to change at all. You'll slot this thing in. This thing in the middle will encrypt the data on the way to the database and decrypt it on the way back from the database. And the concept is that this is better than database encryption because you've now separated the key from the data. And that is helpful, right? It's a step in the right direction. It's certainly more annoying for hackers, unless, of course, they hacked the app, in which case, what do they care, right? It's all there. It depends on your threat model and what you're trying to protect against. It's maybe slightly better. This is the type of solution that's doing well right now, in part because, what does IT control? This is an IT's control. So, third pattern. I call this the key custodian pattern. This is the idea where you have a third party that holds all the keys. And that third party has some access control rules, and they'll hand out the keys as necessary to the person that needs it if they pass their access control checks. And the concept here is a split knowledge concept. Now, instead of being key and data in the same data center in the same location, they're separated, one by different organizations, different networks. They're much more separated, and they come together in the client, and the client is where the decryption actually happens. So this is client-side encryption with shared keys, basically, with a bunch of symmetric keys handed out like cookies, and or antivirus. Of the kind I've been handing out, that is. The idea is, so it separates it. It's fairly similar to CASB in some ways, except that this isn't something you can just transparently do. Typically, this is done with work by the application developer. This is integrated. This is something that's done so that they know and understand what data is encrypted. They understand that data is dark to them, except in the client, where they can maybe do stuff in the client, move more kind of stuff into the client for what types of operations they do, whether that's a browser or a web app or a mobile app or whatever. And that's a pattern that's growing. There's a few companies that are doing well with it right now. Baffle is one, mostly startups. Yeah.
Would the HashiCorp's Vault be like a key custodian?
Not really, because it's in your same data center. So a key custodian is really a split trust model, primarily. I see what you mean. So it's handing out keys based on access rules. So that is confusing. They in this case, I'm talking about the split trust model of key custodianship.
Like Proton Mail or LastPass, where they're doing all the decryption in the browser only?
So that's a little bit different, though, because there isn't a party that can see the keys to your data.
Oh, because I own the keys solely. I see. Yeah.
Correct. So actually, Proton Mail is an example of a zero trust. Actually, it's different. It's a different model than what I've shown here. Okay. But that is an example of a zero trust where the service can't see your data. It's in the client, and you hold the keys that decrypt your data. Or in the case of Proton Mail, you have the password that the key is derived from that decrypts your stuff. So this is, pause, full disclosure. My company, Iron Core Labs, we sell this. We also sell basically a SaaS Shield type of a product to SaaS companies. So I have a couple horses in this game. Also, I quit a really cushy job to go do this stuff because I think it's super important, right? And I don't have weekends and vacations anymore. So in the model I'm showing here, this is very much what Iron Core does. This is not intended to be, however, an advertisement, but I'll tell you quickly what we do, which is essentially there's a third party that's facilitating. It doesn't have to be a third party, though. It doesn't matter if that's hosted in your infrastructure. That facilitation allows for things to be decrypted, but can't itself decrypt anything. So what happens is every user that needs to use the data, whether it's actually a user or a service or a server or whatever, has its own keys provisioned. Those keys can either access data or not, depending on how you've set up your access controls, and that's cryptographically backed access control. So that's pretty cool. It requires application work. And it requires a little more application work because it's certainly not transparent or proxy invisible stuff, right? So this is something that has to be built in and thought about, which is, for good, for better, and for worse. I think generally for better, but that's what that is.
So could you what's the facilitator doing here? Can you describe what's happening here a little bit more?
Yeah, so if you wanted to get down to cryptography, it's a multi-party computation with proxy re-encryption. That would be the technical way of saying it. Another way to say that would be there's a level of delegated access controls here. So we encrypt effectively to a group, and then members of the group can decrypt once the data has been transformed from ciphertext to ciphertext. And that facilitator is transforming the ciphertext such that someone can use their key to decrypt it.
Okay, but without the facilitator, it can't be decrypted?
Correct. So which gives us an unbypassable audit trail because the facilitator produces an audit trail with every data access, so we know anytime the data is accessed, it doesn't matter where it's stored, right?
Facilitator can't decrypt it themselves.
Facilitator can only transform from ciphertext to ciphertext, and then not arbitrarily, only if the owner of what it was encrypted to has delegated access. Yeah. So this is pretty neat. Unbypassable audit trails, doesn't matter where the data is stored, throw that data to the wind. This is what I was getting at when we start talking about move the perimeter to the data. It's cryptographic access controls. That's what I think is the evolution. All right, so Ben, ounce of prevention, pound of cure. If you just take one thing away, I feel like a lot of folks are sitting on the sideline. Right? It's like, well, I don't know. Do we have to do anything about this PII stuff now? Should we wait and see what those, who gets slapped down and how badly? I'd argue this is going to take you a while to solve. You better get going on it now. If you don't get going on it now, you might be one of those examples because those fines are going to start picking up this year and really get going next year. And if you remember back kind of towards the beginning of the presentation where I said, despite all those privacy laws passing, not all of them are active. In fact, most of them aren't active and enforced yet. Today, 10% of people in the world are covered by privacy laws, and in 2023, 65% will be. Let's see. My pleasure. Yeah.